Hello, my name is John Cantlie. I'm a British journalist who used to work for some of the bigger newspapers and magazines in the UK, including the Sunday Times, the Sun, and the Sunday Telegraph. In November 2012, I came to Syria, where I was subsequently captured by the Islamic State. Now, nearly 2 years later, many things have changed, including the expansion of the Islamic State to include large areas of eastern Syria and western Iraq, a landmass bigger than Britain and many other nations. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking he's only doing this because he's a prisoner. He's got a gun at his head and he's being forced to do this, right? Well, it's true. I am a prisoner. That I cannot deny. But seeing as I've been abandoned by my government and my fate now lies in the hands of the Islamic State, I have nothing to lose. Maybe I will live and maybe I will die. But I want to take this opportunity to convey some facts that you can verify. Facts that, if you contemplate, might help preserving lives.
Hi everybody. In my previous video, I already talked about why terrorist organizations like the Islamic State are filming their executions and even distributing that footage. You know, I already said that initially it was hard for me to understand why they're doing this, because it's so obvious that this will only cause Western countries to join the war against the Islamic State. So I thought from their perspective, this must be stupid, because it only increases their opposition, especially their military opposition. So, but I already said that the real reason they're doing this is I think they're aware of that. Their leaders. The leaders of the Islamic State are aware of that, and they're intentionally doing that because they need the war. They need there to be a conflict between the Western world and the Islamic world, because if the West hates the Islamic State, they will send in drones, and those drones inevitably will also kill civilians. Right? I mean, that happens from time to time. It's inevitable in a war that you also have civilian casualties, even if it's just by accident. So what happens then is, and this is very interesting, I watched a quote from, this was a Taliban leader. He said that it was very difficult for him to recruit fighters suicide fighters for the Taliban, or just fighters in general, and that he goes from village to village, and it's very difficult for him to even find one person who's willing to join the Taliban and fight for them. But then, if in a town or in a village, an American drone crashes into a building, killing civilians, he doesn't even have to go there. The whole town comes to him willingly and wants to join the Taliban. So, and this is precisely the kind of effect that the Islamic State is hoping to get. They want Western countries to attack them, because that will only cause the civilian population in the Islamic State to join their cause and to support them. Because if they lose the support of their own people, they're done for, right? They know that, so they make sure to they want to make sure that the war is basically ongoing. And that the war goes on. They need the war so as to get support from their own people. That's why they're filming their executions, and that's why they make such videos like with John Cantlie where it is obvious that he's being forced to do this. He even says himself that basically he's forced at gunpoint to do this. He says that himself, and they spread this video around, knowing full well that everybody knows that he's being brainwashed. Also, this again causes. Increases the conflict, and that's exactly what they want. So I already said that the easiest way to defeat such terrorist groups is by simply, not going down that path, not returning violence with violence, and not returning hate with hate, because that's exactly what they need. That's exactly what they want. So don't give it to them. I already said that. And it's not just, the Islamic State or Islamic terrorist groups who are using that tactic. It's a communist party. Basically, communist party of all countries is pretty much using that kind of tactic. And of course, it's especially obvious in China. I already made some videos about that. In China, they are also filming their executions, making that public and spreading that around. It's the same tactic. And also, they are also filming basically their brainwashing sessions. I already did a video about that, so I'm probably gonna put in a link here somewhere so you can watch that. Anyway, But let's go a little bit about let's go a little more into how this brainwashing works. And I think the video with John Cantlie is an excellent example on showing how brainwashing basically works. If you watch the video with him, it's basically he's being forced to do a propaganda video, right? There were a few things that are really that were really striking me, because they're so typical of brainwashing. And if you watch the video, it's very interesting, and I'll show some examples of that. He doesn't deny the fact that he is in grave danger. He doesn't deny the fact that basically he's forced to say all this at gunpoint. And he doesn't deny the fact that it's very likely that they will kill him. But then he spends basically the entire video trying to convince us, the viewers, that all this is not so much the fault of the Islamic State as it is not so much the fault of the terrorist group who are doing all that to him, but rather is the fault of Great Britain, who refuse to pay the ransom. And this is so typical. And of course, right now he's being forced to say that. He has to say that, and he has to say what they tell him, otherwise they'll just shoot him. He knows that. And we know that. And this is why for the viewers this kind of propaganda doesn't have any effect, because we all know that he just says all the propaganda because he's forced to. We all know that. But for him, it's a different story. Because at the beginning, he has to say it because he's forced to. But as time passes, and you can see this in the video, I think increasingly he starts to actually believe that. And you can see it. It's not when he talks about how the British government has abandoned him, and he repeats that and repeats that. He says that in every video. The first sentence he says is how he has been abandoned by the British government, and basically how it is how his predicament is the fault of the British government. And he repeats and repeats that at the beginning of every video. It's the first sentence he says. And he also gives so many examples of why this would be the case. And when he says that, he sounds convincing. You know, it's not like the rest of the video where he's just repeating their propaganda. When he says that, it looks to me like he is really starting to believe that. And that's so typical, because that's exactly what the people who are holding him hostage want. And that is exactly how brainwashing works. And when I talk about brainwashing, I don't mean the kind of brainwashing, you know, like, oh, look, this salesperson has brainwashed me into buying his soap for such an expensive price. No, that's not the type of brainwashing I'm talking about, because nowadays people use the word brainwashing for pretty much everything. For all kinds of, you know, manipulative tactics or psychological manipulation. That's not what I mean. I mean real brainwashing. I mean the Stockholm syndrome type of brainwashing. You know, that really alters your way of thinking for an indefinite amount of time, not just for a short time period. That, you know, because when somebody puts a gun to your head and says, you know, repeat our propaganda or we will shoot you, will you do it? Of course you will do it, because you don't want to die. That's not yet brainwashing, because as soon as he puts that gun away, you will stop saying the stuff he forces you to say. Just saying it because you're forced to. But the goal of this kind of real brainwashing, of the Stockholm syndrome kind of brainwashing, is to get you to do what they want, even after they have put the gun away. And how do they do that? This John Cantlie is an excellent example. Of course, as I said, I could also use examples from China and other communist countries, and I have put you some examples of that in the links. As I said, I could also show you examples from other countries, from like communist countries, where they're also using this kind of tactics and where they're also filming the process. But this particular film with John Cantlie is a very good example, because you can see all the little things that give away the brainwashing. And you can see it so well, so I'll just use that as an example. I'm not doing that because I'm using that as a general example. You know, it's not just the Islamic State or Islamic terrorists who are using that kind of tactic. It's a general tactic. So I just use that as an example to show you how it works. So and this is John Cantlie's brainwashing is not yet completed, and but it's in the process, and you can, because this is the first step. When he starts, what they want, if somebody is if somebody gets this kind of Stockholm kind of brainwashing, the Stockholm syndrome kind of brainwashing, this is the first step. You need to get him to think that it isn't, that his predicament isn't really the fault that of the people who are keeping him captive and who are doing this to him, but of the external world, the external enemy. You know, every kind of every terrorist or every organization who uses those kind of brainwashing tactics, they have external enemies. They might not really be their enemies, but they need enemies. Even if they have none, they just make up enemies. You know, it's like communists. You know, they have all kinds of enemies that don't even exist, but they need those enemies. You know, in China they're always saying, "Oh yeah, evil Western forces." Or for example, like in the Hong Kong protests right now, they keep repeating, that it would be evil Western capitalist forces who would be inciting the students in Hong Kong to protest, when in reality there are no foreign forces there. It's just the students themselves. The whole foreign forces part is complete rubbish. But they need external enemies. If they don't have external enemies, they just make them up because they need them. Because this is very important for this step right now. You have to get the victim to focus their hate not on the perpetrators themselves, but on the external enemies. And you can see this so well in this video of John Cantlie, where he really starts to believe that all this is the fault of the British government for not buying him out, for not paying the ransom. And he keeps repeating and repeating that, but he never says that, oh, maybe it's the fault of the people who are keeping me in prison and torturing me in the first place. Of course, he can't say that because if he would dare to say that, they would just shoot him. So at the beginning, he can't say that. But if he keeps repeating and repeating that and repeating that it is the external foreign forces, or whatever you may call them, in this case the British government, who are responsible for his predicament when they're obviously not responsible for it. If he keeps repeating that, he starts to believe that, and he has to believe that, because if he doesn't believe that, they kill him. So it's also an act of self-preservation. He's afraid of dying, so he does his best to convince himself that it's not really the fault of the perpetrators, but the fault of the external enemy, whoever it may be. So having that kind of external enemy is very important in the brainwashing process. And in this sense, this video of John Cantlie also not only serves as propaganda and to incite hatred, but also serves as a means to brainwash John Cantlie himself, because the more he has to repeat that it's all the fault of the British government, the more he starts to believe that. And the more, he has to convince himself of actually believing that, because his life depends on it. Because if he were to blame the people who are actually responsible for it, his captors, they would shoot him. But once he really starts to believe that, it's very difficult to undo that. Once he has convinced himself that, oh, it's not the fault of the perpetrators, but the fault of the external enemy, whoever it may be, it's very difficult, to change this thinking around again. Right now he convinces himself of that because he wants to live, because he has to. But once he really starts believing that, it's very difficult to stop believing it again. And also this is, what they're doing is, they're not only, you can see that right now they're forcing him to do things. They're forcing him to say all that propaganda. And they and you can see later on they use him as a kind of regular reporter, kind of. It's now he's like their spokesperson or something. He became like their spokesperson, and he's basically doing a regular show for them, where he's repeating all their propaganda. And of course he has to do that. He's forced to do that. But suppose now he would be rescued, and he would be freed. Or suppose now the British government would pay the ransom and he would be freed. Now what do you think would happen? It would be very difficult for him, because they forced him to do things that he did not want to do, right? And he would be like, oh, okay, now I'm free, but when I was in captivity, I did all the stuff for them. They forced me to do all those things against my will, and I did that. I mean, I went along with that. And this is such a typical tactic. If you speak German, in the past I also did an interview with Xiong Wei, who was in a forced labor camp in China. And I also did some things to help her get free, and it worked.
eventually, she was released and was sent back to Germany. I know several cases like this, and several of my friends have been sent to a labor camp in China, and of course I try to help them so that they get released. And in some cases, they really did get free. Xunwei isn't the only case. I have several friends who were then eventually released because of our efforts, because we did our best to try and expose the labor camp and try to put pressure on the labor camp in China so that at least those kinds of people who are from foreign countries like Germany, that at least those get released. And it worked. And they did get released, and they did get sent back to Germany. But what is not in the interview with Xunwei, but what I saw when I was with her, and this is so typical because this happens to so many people who have been sent to a labor camp in China, and you can't see that in the interview. But she was actually, after the interview, we were still walking, around the city, and I showed her the city, and we were talking, and I was saying, I was just glad that she's back, and we were talking, and anyway, but she didn't seem relaxed. She was very tense. Of course, this is understandable because she has just been released from a forced labor camp, but she was very, very tense, and she also she was full of self-blame. She blamed herself. She hated herself. I didn't notice this at first, but when I spent some time with her, I noticed that she truly, truly hated herself. And I couldn't understand why would she hate herself? And she talked a little about it. And of course, similar to like in the case of John Cantlie, when she was imprisoned, she was forced to do things against her will. She was forced to do things that she did not want to do, and yet she would not have done would she not have been forced to do it at gunpoint. And of course, if you're forced to do something at gunpoint, you will do pretty much anything because you don't want to die. It's understandable. It's not really your fault. It's the fault of the guy who's pointing a gun at your head, right? But even so, once they are released, they still blame them. They think, they forced me to do all that, and I did all the bad things that they said I had to do, and they blame themselves for it. Yeah. And this is also reinforced by the fact that during that whole brainwashing process, they want you to not blame the actual perpetrators who are pointing the gun at your head. They want to indoctrinate you that it's not the fault of the perpetrators. But once you really believe that it's not the fault of the perpetrators, well, then just whose fault is it? And then you start to think, oh shit, it's all my fault. I did that. It's my fault, But it's not their fault. They might have done things against their conscience, like John Cantlie doing all those propaganda reports for the Islamic State. And I'm sure if they wouldn't have forced him to do that, he wouldn't have done that. But now, if he ever gets free, he will probably blame himself for that, for having done that, and it will be difficult for him to realize that it really isn't his fault, that it really is the fault of the perpetrators, because he was indoctrinated to think, oh, it's not the fault of the perpetrators, it's the fault of external enemies like, I don't know, the British government, whatever, And the more he thinks that, the more he will also blame himself. Because then he fails to realize that it's all the fault of the guy who's pointing a gun at his head. So then he will blame himself. And he will live with that blame. And he doesn't want to live with that blame, of having had to act against his conscience. He doesn't want to face that blame. Because it's very difficult if you were forced to do something against your conscience. It's very difficult. It destroys you from the inside. Because every day you're thinking, oh, I acted against my conscience. Oh, how can I live with myself? So, and as to find a way to live with himself, they will try to convince themselves that all this shitty propaganda that the terrorist organizations, be it the Communist Party or the Islamic State or whatever terrorist organization it may be, that all this propaganda is true. That everything they made you to say is true. That all the propaganda is true. And that it's all the fault of foreign forces like the British government or capitalist foreign US forces, whatever. It's all their fault. And you know that it's not true. You know that it is all propaganda. And you know that it is all lies. And initially you said all this stuff against your conscience, but now you want to believe it. Why? Because you don't want to live with that blame. You don't, because the option for you, the other option is just to blame yourself. Because, you know, you rather blame the foreign forces, you rather blame America, or you rather blame the British government or whoever, and you rather blame the capitalists or whoever it may be, than having to blame yourself for acting against your conscience. So you deny all that. You start to convince yourself that what you did is right, and that all the propaganda is right, because you don't want to live with that blame. And that is how brainwashing works. And that kind of brainwashing lasts, because your guilt lasts, because they made you do some things against your conscience. So you don't want to face that. So you convince yourself that the propaganda they told you is true, and that it is all the fault of the British government or whatever. So this is how brainwashing works. And it's very sad. Of course, the truth is, it's not the fault of the British government. It's all just their propaganda. It's all lies. And initially, you knew that it was all lies. You wanted to believe that lie. But the truth is, it's not the fault of the British government or foreign forces or capitalists or whatever. And it's not your fault. It's the fault of the guy who was pointing a gun at your head. But this is what is very difficult for those kind of hostages to realize. You know, for us it's very easy to say, oh, well, it's obviously the fault of the guy who's pointing a gun at your head. But if there is a gun pointed at your head, then it's a different picture, right? It's easy to say that, oh, it's obviously the fault of the terrorists when you're just watching that. And when the terrorists are not pointing a gun at your head, then it's very easy to say that. But when you're actually in that situation, and when you're actually really afraid of dying, it's a different situation, and you will say anything so that they don't kill you. And this is exactly what they want. This is exactly how their tactic works. But of course, if you have been in such a situation, what you have to realize is the truth is, it really isn't your fault, and it's also not the fault of the British government. It's the fault of the guy who was pointing a gun at your head.